I'm pleased now to be joined by the former head of counter-terrorism, the Ministry of Defence, Major General Chip Chapman. Major General, thank you very much for joining me. How seriously should we be taking what's going on in the Red Sea, and what do you think the implications are for the United Kingdom?
Well, we should take it very seriously. In essence, this is what the Houthis would say is part of the theatre of war against the Israelis. And from both their perspective and the Iranian perspective, that is a unity of fronts and a ring of fire around the Israelis. Now, we already had, early in the conflict, a ballistic missile launched of 1,000-mile range. It was an exo-atmospheric interception by the Israelis towards Eilat, the port. And from a Western perspective, one of the vital interests has always been that we keep the sea lanes open. The real problem to be solved is what we call A2AD. That's the anti-access area denial, which is able to be done by both ballistic missiles and coastal defense cruise missiles. That is the problem to be solved. You can either solve that by deterrence, which we have in one sense with the fact that the small swarm boats, which occurred on the 1st of January, have not been seen again. But we haven't deterred these ballistic and cruise missiles. As you said, Jacob, earlier on, the 9th of January was that 21 missile attack. And indeed, in the last hour, we've seen the 27th attack notified by Central Command, CENTCOM. And so I think we are getting to the stage where one of the guys that I used to work with in CENTCOM and was the former CENTCOM commander, General Frank Mackenzie, has said, is using a baseball analogy. At the moment, we're catching, that is catching in a defensive posture with Operation Prosperity Guardian. What we'll probably be doing in the future is pitching, that is, we'll have to take offensive action against some of these Houthi aspects and destroy the cruise missiles, the radar sites, to try and further deter them. Now, the thing which is difficult about that is not the actual kinetic action itself, but is this to be a single strike, or is it to be an elongated campaign? And there's always a risk if you go into an elongated campaign, because we've had since 2015 Operation Decisive Storm by Saudi Arabia and the UAE in Yemen, which was neither decisive nor a storm.
No, that's the point, that what's been going on in Yemen's been rumbling on for many years and no decisive action has been taken. If the US particularly, but supported by the UK, were to get directly involved, is there decisive action that can be taken that has the limited effect of securing shipping in the Red Sea, or would it have to go further than that and see stability brought to Yemen more broadly?
Well, I don't think there's been stability in Yemen more broadly, really, since it came together as a country in 1990, and that's part of the problem, that you've had North Yemen and South Yemen sort of brought together. I think one of the things which could be done, and this is the sort of right of arc from both perspectives, the right of arc from an Iranian perspective, if you take the Houthi as one of their proxy forces, is that they've said that they might close the Straits of Gibraltar. Now, you might say they haven't got the capability to do that, but they've also got the proxy force with a Polisario front in Morocco. So although it might seem unlikely, it doesn't mean that it wouldn't happen. From a coalition perspective, particularly an American perspective, we would look back to Operation Praying Mantis in 1988, when the Americans destroyed 5 Iranian ships. And essentially that meant that the Iranians had to drink from the chalice of poison, as we say, which they've had to do a number of times. So it's the risk-reward calculus altering that probably for the Iranians more than the Houthi. But one of the variables which you don't know in all this is what the Iranians call the Alavi doctrine, which is this sort of religious fundamentalism allied to some sort of Yemeni nationalism or Houthism, which means that they have this inculcation that they might fight to the death. So trying to be rational and say, well, alter their calculation may not work for the future. One of those variables which is very, very difficult when you're taking action.
And you mention Iran in all this, which is so important, the Iranian influence, money, power. Is this essentially part of the Iranian and Russian desire to destabilize the West?
I think you could take that. I would say that's overplayed. There have been a number of fault lines really in the Middle East since 2011 with the Arab Spring, and really it's the fact that the Middle East is falling apart, and you've got a number of shifts within this. You've got Shia versus Sunni, you've got Assad versus the rebels, Turks versus the Kurds, Iran versus Israel, Israel versus Hamas and Hezbollah, and everyone versus IS. And that real kaleidoscope and mosaic is just very difficult to shift. It is true that the Iranians want the Americans out of the region. That is why some of their proxy forces, the Popular Mobilization Front, for example, in Iraq, have had over 126 attacks against American assets in that region. So that is part of their design, to try and get the Americans out of the region and to have regional hegemony.
Well, thank you very much, Major General, for that. And now let's talk to my panel. GB News' senior political commentator, Nigel Nelson, and the editor of Conservative Fame, Paul Goodman. Nigel, what can a UK government do? How far can it go to protect these shipping lanes?
We'll have to see after the cabinet meeting. We'll get some sort of indication of just how far Rishi Sunak wants to go. As Chip was saying, one would rather hope we don't get embroiled in another foreign war, that it will be a surgical strike, it'll be quick, it'll do the job and protect the shipping. The danger, obviously, is extending the war from Gaza further and further afield. It looks like Iran would actually stay out of it, but we don't know. Iran is quite happy to back the Houthis, back Hezbollah, but not get directly involved. Let's hope it stays that way.
And we've always got hanging over us the spectre of Iraq, haven't we, of a UK government getting involved in something that then got out of control and proved to be much longer, more extended, more costly in lives and in cash terms than ever anticipated.
Yeah, I think probably Libya is almost a better analogy for something like this, because that was just airstrikes, but we left Libya in a complete mess. I mean, the trouble is, whenever we do these things, we don't think about the consequences afterwards. You mentioned Iraq. IS probably wouldn't have happened if we'd actually had some kind of plan to deal with Iraq after the war.
And possibly with Syria as well. But, Paul, what is the appetite within Conservative circles for liberal interventionism? Or is this not liberal interventionism, but in fact self-defence?
I'd go back to where you started, which is the Iraq War. And I think for everyone older than a certain age, everyone remembers Iraq. So on the one hand, I think your viewers might think keeping the shipping lanes open, helping to keep the price of oil down, concerted international action, that all sounds fine. But I suspect in people's mind there will be more than a sliver of doubt of exactly where does this end. As the Major General was suggesting that airstrikes might not do the trick. What then? Do you need ground troops? What's the result of that? By the way, one footnote. This strikes me as being slightly awkward on the face of it for Keir Starmer, because I know where Stop the War will go with this, and they will say this is unjustified at a time when the war in Gaza rages on. So this is problematic for the government, but also, as Gaza also is, quite difficult for Keir Starmer.
Difficult for the opposition to handle.
Yes.
And then there are the questions of resources. Do we have the resources with a navy that can't recruit to carry out the action that we might need to carry out?
That's the question. I mean, Nigel was saying in some ways Libya would be a better comparison. Well, it will be if it's simply a matter of strikes. But if the strikes themselves don't do the trick, what do you do then?
What do you do then? What becomes the next stage
That's the frightening
in
bit.
this?
Yes, I mean, Paul just mentioned the idea of possibly putting ground troops in. I think that would have to be a no-no after what happened in Iraq.
But haven't we, to some extent, been fighting a proxy war in Yemen via our friends, our allies, the Saudis, who we've sort of half-backed and half been nervous of? And this has allowed something to rumble on because there's been a lack of decisiveness from the West.
Yes, and that's right, that Saudi haven't won their war in Yemen, and they've been using an awful lot of British hardware to go and fight it. And we still don't have a resolution to that. So from that point of view, yes, you're right. But I think we have to keep this completely separate, what is actually going on internally in Yemen and what is going on in the Red Sea. The important thing is that shipping can go up and down the Red Sea.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much to my panel.